Hi, and welcome to this talk on getting started with IdentityServer4. My name is Kevin Jones from Rock Solid Knowledge. So in this talk, we'll show how to install IdentityServer, but we'll do it using an in-memory store, just to keep things simple initially. We'll write an API client that we can use with IdentityServer that will need protecting, and we'll write a web client where the user can log on. We'll also have that web client call the protected API, and we'll show how to tie all of these together. Now, this talk is part of a series of talks, and in the other talks, we'll see how to update IdentityServer to use entity framework stores rather than the in-memory stores. We'll also update IdentityServer to use the ASP.NET Identity for its user store, and those two topics will be covered in one talk. We'll then have a talk on hosting IdentityServer on Azure, and then finally, a talk on adding admin UI to this instance of IdentityServer that is hosted on Azure. Okay, so let's move on to installing IdentityServer using in-memory stores. So the simplest way to create an IdentityServer instance is to use a .NET template. To do that, we first have to install the .NET templates. To do that, we run .NET new -i IdentityServer4.templates. And here we can see the templates that have been installed. And we can see that are things like IS4InMem, IS4EF. So if I run .NET new IS4InMem, this creates me an instance of IdentityServer, as it says here, with in-memory stores and test users. However, we aren't going to do this, as we want to understand exactly what's needed when we create an instance of IdentityServer. Instead, we're going to start from scratch. So here, I'm in a new directory called IDS, and from here, I'm going to do .NET new web. And this will create me an empty web project based on .NET Core. And if I look in this directory, we can see there's not a lot to this. We have a program CS, startup CS, and a project file. So let's go and open that project file and add the things that we need to make this an instance of IdentityServer. Okay, so here, I've created a new solution using JetBrains Rider. And into this, I've added our project. It's simply called IDS. As we can see, we just have a program CS file and a startup CS file in here and nothing else. The only thing I've changed here is that in launch settings.json, I've changed the ports to be running on. So this project will run on port 5443 for HTTPS and 5000 if we were using HTTP. So the first thing I need to do here is go to Manage NuGet Packages and add the IdentityServer4 package to this project. And then when I've done that, if I go into startup.cs, it's here that I'm going to configure IdentityServer. So in my configure services call, I call services.add_IdentityServer. And then here, I'm going to tell IdentityServer where to find things like its clients and its resources that we'll use when we do our authentication. So initially, to set this up, I'm just going to add these calls. So we add a list of in-memory clients that's currently empty. Similarly, a list of in-memory identity resources, API resources, and scopes, and also an empty set of test users. And we'll come back and add data to these in a moment. I'm also going to call add developer sign-in credential here. And we do this because various things in the tokens that IdentityServer delivers for us needs to be signed, and this developer sign-in credential provides that signing material for us. Once I have that, in my configure call, we can add IdentityServer into the pipeline. So remember that IdentityServer is a piece of middleware. So here, I can call app.useIdentityServer. And we're now ready to go. Now at the moment, we have no APIs defined, we have no clients defined, and we have no users defined. But we can still run this. So we run it and the application runs. At the moment, we have no controllers and views here, so it's simply printing out hello world. But in here, I can ask IdentityServer for the OpenID Connect discovery document. And we get to that by going to .wellknown OpenID configuration. And indeed, we get the discovery document. There's some defaults in here. So we get some default grant types and default response types. But notice, for example, there are no claims here yet, and the only supported scope is offline access. So let's fix that for this in-memory setup. So before we go any further and add things like clients and resources, what about these credentials? So here we called add developer sign-in credential. So what does that mean? Well, if I go and look at the Identity Server documentation, there's a section here on key material. I notice it says that for add developer signing credential, this is for dev scenarios only. And it says it's for when we don't have a certificate to use. Instead, we should be calling add signing credential or add validation key. And for things like add signing credential, we provide an X509 certificate to use. So we provide our own signing material. So be aware this is for demo purposes only. Okay, so with that out of the way, what are these things that we have here called clients and resources? So before we get into the detail of these, let me show you the clients and resources we're going to add here. So I mentioned earlier that you can create an instance of Identity Server from a template, and that template provides some data that's used to populate these values. And I'm just going to use that data in this demonstration. So I have a file called config.cs that I'll copy into the project. And then in here, we have a few things that we're going to use. So first of all, users. So users are obviously going to be users of our applications. And here we have two, one called Alice and one called Bob. And then further down here, we have a couple of clients. So these are the client applications that will be talking to Identity Server to be asked to be allowed to use our applications. And here we have two. We have an M2M client, that's machine to machine. So that's an API client. And we have our interactive client. So that's essentially our web client. And there's some configuration associated with both of these things. We also have some resources and scopes. So the resource is something that we're trying to protect. So here we have an API resource that's called Weather API that has two scopes associated with it, Weather API.read and Weather API.write. So obviously this means there's something that can read from the Weather API and something that can update the Weather API, add, update, or delete items using this API. And we also have some identity resources as well. And these are things associated with a given identity. So the first two identity resources here, OpenID and Profile, represent some standard OpenID Connect scopes that we want Identity Server to support. And the OpenID scope, for example, is always required if we're using OpenID. So given that we have these resources and scopes and clients and users, how do we use them? So in my code here, rather than providing an empty list of clients, we can say config.clients. And this is a static property within that config class. I can then do the same thing for the resources and the scopes and for the test users. So let me update those now. So now we've added our identity resources, API scopes, and the test users. So if I rerun Identity Server and go back to the browser and refresh, we can now see the various scopes and claims have been added to our discovery document. Okay, so now that we have this, how do we use it? So the way an application would use this is that it would request a token from Identity Server and then use that token to communicate with our API, for example. So if I look in our config file here, we have a couple of clients. And the one we're going to use first of all is this M2M client. So notice the client has an ID, which is M2M client, and it has this thing called a secret. And when we add this secret into Identity Server, we hash it. So the secret is not very secret, it's super secret password, but it's stored in Identity Server as a hash. So the client knows this value and uses this value and its ID to ask Identity Server for a token. And the way we do that is something like this. This is a curl command. We'll use as an example. So we're going to send an HTTP post to our endpoint, which is localhost 5443, but the connect token endpoint to request the token. We specify the client ID, which is m2m.client. We specify the client secret, which is super secret password. And we specify the scope that we want to use, which is weather API.read. And we also specify what's called the grant type. In this case, we're saying, I'm a client and please provide me a token for that client. So if I take this command and go to my shell and paste it in and send it to my Identity Server, indeed, we get back a token. So we get back this JSON object that contains an access token. And this is the value of the access token. And we'll see what that value is in a moment. We also get back some other information as well. So it tells us how long this token lives. It tells us the token type, and this is known as a bearer token. and it confirms the scopes that we've asked for. So in this case, weather API.read. So this token is known as a JSON web token or a JOT, a JWT. And if I take this token and copy the value, there are a couple of websites I can go to that will decode the token for me. So things like jot.io or this one, jot.ms. If I paste the token into here, then it will decode the token on my behalf. And notice the token has 3 parts to it. And the part we care about is the part in blue. And this contains the claims that are contained within this token. And if we look inside here to get some more detailed information, we can see the things like the not before claim, the expiration date claim, the issuer claim, the audience claim, and also things like the scopes that this token contains. So once a client has this token, we can then call a protected API using this token. So for the next part of this talk, we'll write that protected API and then show how to call that API using such a token. So we've seen how to get a token. So what I'd like to do now is to show you how to use that token. So to do that, I'm going to create an API, and that API will be protected. And so to use that API, we'll need to ask IdentityServer for a token and then have the API check that token. So from the shell here, I do .NET new and use the API template. And this creates me an ASP.NET Core Web API. And again, I've created a solution inside JetBrains Rider, and I've added the project to that solution. Notice the directory in which I created the project was called Weather API, so it's also called the project Weather API. And again, like the IdentityServer project, I've updated my launch settings.json, so this thing listens on HTTPS port 5445. And if I run this application and we hit the browser, we get back some temperature data. And this is just randomly generated within the application itself. Okay, so I want to protect this application using what's known as bearer authentication. So we saw when we created the token from IdentityServer, we got back something known as a bearer token. So any client we use will need to grab a bearer token and send it to this application to be authorized to use the application. So to do that, if I go to Manage NuGet Packages, I need to add a package called IdentityServer4.access token validation. And we add it to this application. Then once I have that, inside the application's startup CS, where we call configure services, I need to add 2 things. I need to add a call to add authentication, specifying the scheme, and it's going to be the bearer scheme. And then we add the identity server support for this. And I then call add identity server authentication. And again, we specify the scheme, which is the bearer scheme, and we pass in some options. And these options tell this application how to call identity server. We specify the API name, which is the resource that's being protected, and that's weather API. And the authority is the address that identity server is listing on. So HTTPS localhost 5443, if you remember from a few moments ago. So we need to add one more thing. So here we call use authorization. And we also need to add authentication into the pipeline. So I need to add use authentication here as well. Now, be careful here. There seems to be a bug in .NET Core 3 where you have to add use authentication before use authorization. Otherwise, you get into a weird redirect loop with IdentityServer. So before we use this, I need to protect the API. So if I go into my controllers and to the weather forecast controller, I need to add the authorize attribute to this controller. So the controller is now protected. So if I rerun the application and go back to the browser and refresh, we get a 401. So we're trying to hit the API without a bearer token. So initially, to access this API, I'm going to use curl from a shell script. So to do that, if I go back to my shell and run the original curl command, and remember this gets me a token. So I'm going to grab this token and copy it, and then I'm going to run this curl command. So this curl command is a get, and it's going to send a get to localhost 5445/weather forecast. So that's my API endpoint to get the details of the weather forecast. But to this, I'm going to add a header, and it's the authorization header. The authorization type is bearer, and this is the bearer token we just got back from the initial curl command where we asked for the token from IdentityServer. So if I grab this command and paste that into my shell, and run the original curl command, we get a 401. So we try to hit the API without a bearer token. So initially, to access this API, I'm going to use curl from a shell script. So to do that, if I go back to my shell and hit return, sure enough, we now get back the temperature data. If I try the same command without the bearer token, it fails. We don't see the failure details here, but it comes back again with a 401. So to access this API now, I need a bearer token. And we get the bearer token from IdentityServer. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm now going to add a web application and then show you how to get this bearer token using that web application and how to access the same API. So this time, let's add the project from within Rider. So I go to Explorer, right-click, Add New Project. I want a web application that I'm going to call Weather MVC. So it'll be my client folder. It's a model view controller application, C#, no authentication. And if I click on Create, it's going to create that project for me. Again in here, I'm going to make sure this is running on the right ports for this demonstration. So I update this, so we're going to run on port 5444. And if you remember, if I look back at my Identity Server setup and look at the client settings here, for my interactive client, we have some redirect URIs set up. And they indeed are pointing at port 5444. So this is the settings for this particular client. So to make my life slightly easier here, I'm going to add a new package. And the package I'm going to add is Identity Model. And this just contains some helpers that I'm going to use from this application. So for this application, I want to do two things. I first of all want to be able to call the API application. And to do that, I need to be able to set the bearer token. So we'll need to make calls to IdentityServer to get that information. To, for example, get the token. And then once I've done that, I want to allow us to log in using this application as well. So I want this application also protected. So when a user tries to hit this application, they'll need to enter their user details to allow them to be authenticated. So first things first, let's add the UI that's going to display the weather information and then show how to get that weather information when we have a protected resource. So in my controller, I'm going to add another endpoint called weather. And from here, I'm going to call the API, get back the weather details, and display those details. So to display those details, we need to have a view, and that view will look like this. So in a moment, we'll create a model called weather data, and then inside here, we'll simply have a table, and then for every item in that model, just display the date and the summary, and the temperature both in Fahrenheit and Celsius. So this model, weather data, will be in the models folder, and it will look like this. So a date time for the date, temperature in Celsius, a temperature in Fahrenheit, and a summary. Okay, so from within the controller, we create a list to hold the weather data we'll get back from the API. And we're going to use an HTTP client to call the API. So inside this using block, we'll call getAsync against the API endpoint and get the result of that call. And then we'll do one of two things. If the call is successful, we'll get the data, convert that JSON into a C# list, and return the view with that data. If the call fails, we'll just throw an exception which says unable to get content. Okay, so let me do a couple of things here. Let me go back into my API code in the controller and remove the authorized attribute and rerun the weather API application. If I then take my weather MVC project and run that and go to /home/weather, sure enough, we get the data. So we know this call is working. So if I go back to my weather API project and put the authorized call back in and rerun the project, and then go to the weather MVC home weather endpoint and refresh, it now fails. We're now getting an exception which says unable to get content. So we need to be authorized. So how do we add this authorization? So we know the way we do this is that when I call the getAsync call here, I need to add a bearer token as part of the request. So I need to add this header. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to introduce a token service. So a service I can plug in anywhere where I need to do this, from which I can get access to this token. So in here, in my weather MVC project, I'll add a new directory called services. And then in here, I'll add 3 files. So the first one is a file called IdentityServer settings. And this is information I need to use when I call IdentityServer. So things like the URL to access the server, the name of the client that I need to get this information about, and the password for this client. Now, in this case, the client is going to be the M2M client. So again, if I go back and look at my identity server setup, this is the M2M client, and the password is going to be called super secret password. And I've configured this to have these settings stored in appsettings.json. And it's this identity server settings section here. I'm not going to go into detail of exactly how I get these values out of here, but it will be in the demo code provided with this video. So the service interface looks like this. Here is one method called getToken. So to get token, we pass it a scope, and it returns me a token for that scope. And we'll see exactly how this is called in a moment. So what about the implementation of this? So the way this works is the same way the curl command works. We need to send a request to the token endpoint. And as part of that request, we need to provide the client ID, the client secret, and the scope. So here we have an API called request client credentials token async. And this comes from the identity model package. These are extension methods provided with that library and extension methods on HTTP client. So we get the client name, the client password, and the scope from our settings. Where do we get the token endpoint from? Well, we can get the token endpoint from the discovery document. And that's this document here. So well-known OpenID configuration. And we can see in here the token endpoint. To get the discovery document, we can use another helper API called getDiscoveryDocumentAsync. I'm doing this in the constructor for this service. And again, we get the discovery URL from our settings. So we call getDiscoveryDocumentAsync. That gives you back the discovery document. I can then take the token endpoint from that discovery document, the client name, the client password, and the scope that we need. And then from that, get back a token. And I can then use this token as the bearer token when I call the API. So to use this, in my controller, I need to inject a token service and store this in a variable. And then when I create the client, I get the token response from the token service. And then on my HTTP client, use another extension method called setBearerToken to add this token to the request. So I need to register my services. So in my configure services method, I add the token service as a singleton. And I also add configuration to extract my identity server settings into this identity server settings instance. So with that in place, if I rerun my weather MVC, and then in the browser, go to /home/weather, it all works again. So we're now getting the appropriate token to send to the API to allow us to be authorized and to access that data. So just to go over this one more time, in the controller, we inject a token service. That token service has a getToken method. Once we get the token, we add it to our HTTP request as a bearer token. The token service gets the discovery document, and then from that discovery document gets the token endpoint, and then from that token endpoint gets the token, specifying the client name and the password. And the scope we're asking for here is the read scope. So we're saying I want a token that allows me to read from this API. Okay, so our client is now protected, but this application, the MVC application itself, isn't. From here, if I'm on this page, I can always request this weather data. What we'd like to happen is that when a user comes to this page, we'd like to authenticate the user. So we're going to show you how to do that using IdentityServer. And to do that, we first need to add a user interface onto our IdentityServer instance. So I'm back in the IdentityServer project here. If I'd built this from the template, this would have come pre-configured with what's known as the Quick Start UI. But if I look in this project at the moment, that's missing. But we can copy the source code for that Quick Start UI directly into the project. And you can do that by going to the GitHub repository. So if I go to this URL, so github.com IdentityServer/IdentityServer4.quickstart.ui, this is the code for that Quick Start UI. And for this, we need the Quick Start directory, the views directory, and the www root directory. And copying those into the project, they look like this. So inside Quick Start, we have various controllers and other models to do with things like account management. So for example, login and creating accounts. We have some consent information. So when the user wants to consent to certain things, we'll see this in a moment. Some things around diagnostics. We have the various views for these, the views for the accounts, for doing the consent. And then in www root, we have the styles and the JavaScript that's used for this user interface. So now that we have the UI code in place, I need to do two things to get IdentityServer to make use of these controllers. In my configure services, I call add controllers with views to add all the controllers to the services collection. And then here where I'm calling use endpoints, I need to call endpoints.map default controller route. And finally, I need to add a call to app.use authorization. And with that in place, I can restart IdentityServer. And go back to the browser and refresh. We now get the IdentityServer user interface. So now that we have that in place, I can update my MVC application to get it to use IdentityServer to do my authentication. Okay, so let's start here. So within the controller, I'm going to mark my weather action as needing authorization. So I mark it as authorize. And then if I go back into my startup code, I can now configure how we do that authorization. So to do this, I need to add a few things to my services collection. So I say services.add authentication, and this is passed in options. And in here, we need to set a couple of things. So the first thing I'm going to set is what's known as the default scheme. The default scheme will be called cookie, and this becomes the name of the cookie that's going to be used to maintain the client's authentication state. So to make sure we have a cookie, we add a cookie, and the name of this is also cookie. We then need to add what's called the challenge scheme. So I say options.default challenge scheme, and we give this a name, and we'll call this OIDC. So we're going to use OIDC as the challenge mechanism for our user. And what this means is that we're going to call off into IdentityServer and get IdentityServer to do the user authentication for us. So to do that, we have to configure OIDC. So before we do that, we need to add a NuGet package. So for the MVC project, I go to Manage NuGet Packages, and into here, I add the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication OpenID Connect package. So we install that. And then once I have that, I can do add OpenID Connect to my services. We pass in the name of the scheme, and that matches the default challenge scheme above. So that's OIDC. And again, it takes an options. And this is where we configure the OpenID Connect server we're going to use. So let me just show you my app settings.json first of all. So in here, I have this interactive service settings section. And these are the settings we're going to use for this interactive client. And here we have things like the authority URL, the client ID, which is interactive, the client secret, and the scopes that we're going to request as part of our OIDC authentication. So back inside where we configure OpenID Connect, we first of all add these three things. We specify the authority that we're getting from configuration. We specify the client ID and the client secret, and we're also getting those from configuration. We then use these three options, response type, use PKC, and response mode, to specify the flow that we want to use when talking to IdentityServer. And this specifies that we're using the authorization code flow. We then specify the scopes that we're asking for. And again, this comes from the interactive service settings scopes section. So that will be weatherapi.read. And then save tokens causes the identity and access tokens to be saved. And that makes these available to other parts of our code. For example, if we call http context.get tokens async. So I need to make one further change. I need to add authentication into the pipeline. So here, where we say app.useAuthorizations, I need to say app.useAuthentication. And now that we have this, I can rerun the application. Okay, so now if we have this, if I restart the application and go back to the browser and I'm still in the home weather URL and I refresh, then it takes me to this page. It's asking me to authenticate. So here I type in the username and password. If you remember, we had an Alice user with an Alice password, and click on login. And that then takes me to the consent page. This is the consent UI. And here it's telling me the name of the application, interactive, and it's telling me what permissions it's asking for. And if I click on allow, I get back to the home weather URL. So I now have access to this, and that's calling the API, and that has access to the API. Okay, so we've seen how to add an in-memory instance of IdentityServer. We've seen how to build an API, how to access that API using a bearer token, how to build an MVC client, and how to access the API from that MVC client, and then how to add authentication to that MVC client. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. The next one in this series will show how to add entity framework into Identity Server. So rather than using in-memory data, our data will be stored in a database. We'll also see in that video how to add ASP.NET Identity to Identity Server to help manage our users.